Good evening. Tonight's story is The Loup Garou from Christmas in French Canada by Louis Frechette. Published in 1899, this book captures an interesting period in the history of the region, and the stories are truly unique. Going back to at least medieval times, there was a European tradition of gathering around the fire at Christmas time and telling scary stories. So, there are a huge number of stories that are about ghosts and witches and monsters, but that are set during the holiday season. I thought I would feature a few stories like this during the month of November to kind of bridge us between Halloween and Christmas. This story is our first visit to Canada and also the first appearance on the channel of a werewolf. Because we are in French Canada, this story is peppered with French terms and phrases. I will put the definitions on the screen, but I also think you could follow along without precise definitions of these terms. Most of them make sense in context. Finally, the first sentence of this story has a huge footnote, which I will put here in the introduction where it makes more sense. Quote, "The present story is not wholly original, some of its features being traditional among our peasants under more or less different forms. The Loup Garou is nothing else than the werewolf of the German legend, founded on the belief that some people could transform themselves into wolves at pleasure. In French Canada, though, a moral has been added to the fantastic tradition. The Loup Garou here is not a sorcerer, but a victim of irreligion. A man who has been 7 years without partaking in the Easter sacrament falls a prey to the infernal power and may be condemned to rove about every night in the shape and skin of a wolf or any other kind of animal according to the nature of his sins. A bloody wound only can release him." End quote. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Have you heard that La Belle Marance de Claude Couture is going to be married? No? Well, she is. The banns are to be published next week. Married to whom? Guess. It's pretty hard to guess. La Belle Marance is surrounded with sweethearts by the score every Sunday that God brings along. With Baptiste Octeau, I bet. No? Well, it must be to Damas Lepente then. No, not at all. Ma foi, it's just as well to tell you at once. She is going to be married to Captain Gosselin of St. Nicholas. To Captain Gosselin of St. Nicholas? Exactly. Well, I declare. You don't say so. She is to take such a miscreant? Well, the fellow is well off, you know. He has made her a present of a nice gold brooch and a diamond ring, and Marance doesn't sneer at that, I tell you. Anyhow, I wouldn't marry him even though he were a seigneur and owned all the farms of the parish. Neither I, a man who has no religion, who hasn't fulfilled the Easter duties for years, who never goes to church nor to confession, who is going to be bewitched into some horrible Loup Garou some day. It's doomed fate for him if he passes 7 years without absolution for his sins. Poor Marance, it's too bad. It's no fun to have your husband converted every evening into a beast, roaming wildly along the roads and through the woods, God knows where. I'd just as soon marry old Harry himself. It is true that there would be a means of releasing him. How? By wounding him, of course, by pricking his forehead, by cutting his ear, his nose, his tail, anything at all with some sharp instrument. The main thing is to draw blood. And the beast will be again a man? At once. Why, thanks. As for me, I prefer a man that needs not to be bled. So do I, exclaimed all the girls. You believe such silly tales, cried a voice. You set of fools. The foregoing conversation was held at an old farmer's of St. Antoine de Tilly, where a number of young people from the neighborhood had gathered for a pléché de blanc indie, a corn bee, which was to be followed by a griddle cake réveillon. As can be seen, the company was indulging in a general chat, and from one subject to the other, the Loup Garou legend had fallen on the tapis. Of course, it is useless to add that the scene takes us back a great many years ago, for, fortunately, our country folk give but very little attention now to these queer superstitions of the past. The interruption brought about by the last speaker is, besides, an evidence that, even in those days, and among our illiterate people, those mysterious traditions found some unbelievers. "All these are grandmother's stories," added the same voice, in answer to the almost unanimous protest which the irreverent Sally had given rise. "Tut, tut, tut. It is not well to treat one's own grandmother with contempt, my young fellow," intervened an old woman, who, taking no part in the épluché, pursued silently her knitting at the light of the hearth, which threw fitful and intermittent glimmers on her long, wrinkled face. "Old people know more than the young," added she. "And, when you have trod my path, you'll not be so ready to scoff at those who believe in the old stories." "So you believe in Loup Garous, Mother Catherine?" said the young interrupter with a provoking smile. "Had you known Joachim Crete as I have, you could not but believe in them also, my friend," retorted the old woman. "I have already heard of that story of Joachim Crete," said one of the hearers. "Why shouldn't you tell it, Mother Catherine?" "I have no objection," said she, dipping her thumb and forefinger into an old horn snuff-box. "It does not harm young folks to know what may happen to those who have no respect for religion and sneer at things they do not understand. It's an old saying with me that the fear of God is never out of place." Unfortunately, poor Joachim Crete didn't think so. He was not precisely what may be called a wicked man, oh no, but he was like many others of our own time. He thought of God and performed his duties only when he had nothing else to do. This is not what helps a man ahead, my friends. He wouldn't have cheated a neighbor out of a copper, no doubt. He observed Lent and Fridays as well as anyone, they said. But he partook of the holy sacraments at Easter time only, once a year and no more. He winked jeeringly when somebody spoke of the church collections, and besides, without being a regular drunkard, he was fond enough of the drop to go to bed every Saturday night, too fuddled to mind if his mill was running on Sunday. For I must tell you, my friends, that Joachim Crete was the proprietor of a mill, a corn mill, situated on the concession of Beausejour on the little river called La Rigole. Of course, it wasn't anything like a seigneurial mill, but it worked the best it could and ground its oats and corn anyway. I fancy I can see it yet, the old mill, seated right along the Chemin du Roi. When we used to go to catechism for our first communion, we little folk never failed to stop there for a rest. There it was that I got acquainted with the wretched man, a man about 40 who had no objection to tease little girls, I may add, without any mischievous meaning. As he was unmarried, he had fixed up a small dwelling inside the mill, where he lived like a bear with a hired man by the name of Hubert Sauvagereau, a fellow who had travelled in the Pays d'Enhaut, who had lived on the rafts, who had been knocking about for years, without, it was evident, having learned much for the benefit of his soul. How had he come to settle at Saint Antoine after such wanderings? Nobody ever knew. All I can say is that if Joachim Crete was not exactly a model for the parish, it was not his hired man who could give him lessons on principles, as people say. With all deference to the company, the fellow had no more religion than a dog. Never was he seen at church, never did he take off his hat to the cavalry, he hardly saluted the curé with the end of his fingers when he met him on the road. In fact, he was a man of poor reputation indeed. "What's all this to me?" said Joachim Crete when the matter was referred to in his presence. "He's a quiet fellow who never faints at work. He is reliable, just as sober as myself. He eats no more than another, and plays checkers to put in the time with me. Nobody would give me better satisfaction, even though he wore out his knees from morning till night at Les Chemins de la Croix." As you see by his own words, Joachim Crete was a checker player, and a good one too, for if anybody had ever won a game of polonaise against him, no one in all Saint Antoine could boast of having him seen lose more than a partie simple. But One must suppose that the fellow Sauvageot was a pretty good match for him, as, especially when the miller had returned home from town in the course of a day with a demijohn, those who passed by the mill in the evening heard them yell, each one in his turn, Manger! Soufflez! Franc coin! Partez nul! And so forth, as in a rage of ambition. But let me reach the adventure you wish me to relate. On that day, it was Christmas Eve, and Joachim Crête had returned from Quebec rather tipsy, and, useless to add, with a fine stock of supplies in the box of his carriole for the festivities. The whole mill was in merriment. My grand old uncle, old José Corriveau, who had a bag full of grain to mill, called in the evening and said to Joachim Crête, "You are going to attend midnight mass, of course?" A grin was the only answer. It was Hubert Sauvageot coming in and seating himself in the corner with his pipe. "We shall see about that," he said. "No joke, young men," added old Corriveau, walking out. "The midnight mass is not a thing to be missed." And he left with a whip in his hand. "Ha, ha, ha," laughed Sauvageot. "But we shall first play a game of checkers, won't we, Monsieur Joachim?" "10, if you wish, old fellow, but before all we must have a smile," was the reply. And the spree had commenced. At about 11 o'clock, a neighbor by the name of Vincent Dubé knocked at the door. "Look here, Joachim," said he. "If you want a place in my berlot to the midnight mass, there is one for you, as I'm alone with the old woman." "Thank you, I've got my own horse," said Joachim Crête. "Are they going to bother us much longer with their midnight mass?" grumbled Hubert Sauvageot when the door was closed. "Let us have a drink," said the miller, and hurrah with the glasses and the checkers. The people who passed by, going to church, riding or on foot, said to each other, "Why, Joachim Crête's mill is still running. He must have quantities to grind. Surely he won't go on working on Christmas, will he? I wouldn't be surprised, especially if his accursed Sauvageot has a hand in it." And so on. In the meanwhile, the mill went on rolling, the game of checkers didn't stop, and the drinking continued. Toasts were endless. Someone knocked at the window. "Hold on, you fellows, it's near 12. The last bell is pealing. It's not very Christian-like what you are doing there." Two voices answered, "Go to blazes! Let us have peace." The last passers-by vanished, and the mill went on rolling. As the weather was calm and quiet, its rumbling noise was heard afar, and the good people hurried away, making the sign of the cross on their breast. Although the church was nearly 2 miles distant from the mill, Joachim Crête could hear clearly the sound of the bell. At the last toll he felt a kind of remorse. "'Tis 12, said he. "If we raise the paddle door—" "Pshaw! Are you such a poltroon?" said Sauvageot. "Here, let us have a horn, and then I'll make you capote." "Well, as to that, you are not fit for it, my young man. Help yourself, and here's your luck. Here's yours, Monsieur Joachim." They had barely replaced their tumblers on the table when the last sound of the bell passed over the mill like a whisper in the wind. It was as rapid as thought. Crack! The mill was stopped dead, just as if a thunderbolt had broken the machinery. A deep silence followed, through which one could have heard the creeping of a mouse. "What's the matter?" cried out Joachim Crête. "Some impudent jokers, no doubt," said the hired man. "Let us go and see, quick." A lantern was lit, and our 2 checker players started, with uncertain steps, in the direction of the undershot wheel. But vainly did they search and poke everywhere. All was in good order, and nothing seemed to have been interfered with. "This is most extraordinary," they said, quite nonplussed. At all events, they oiled the machine, started her again, and returned to their checkerboard, not without making their first call at the table, though. "Your health, Hubert. This is to yours, Monsieur Joachim." But hardly were the glasses emptied when the 2 men started staring at each other with a bewildered expression. They were beastly drunk, first of all, and then the mill had become silent once more. "Some confounded rascals have thrown rubbish into the grindstones," muttered Joachim Crête. "Let the devil wring my neck," jabbered Sauvageot, "if we don't find what's wrong this time." And here are once more our two drunkards, lantern in hand, prowling everywhere about the mill, stumbling and tripping on everything they come across. But all uselessly. There was nothing the matter, either in the grindstones or elsewhere. The machine was started again, but whoosh! Half a turn of the wheel, and that was all. The whole mechanism was at a dead standstill. "The devil take the whole concern!" yelled out Joachim Crete. "Let us go!" A desperate oath was uttered. Hubert Sauvageot, who had probably entangled his feet in some kind of obstacle, had fallen headlong on the floor like a helpless brute. The lantern had gone out of his hand, to be sure, so that it was pitch dark, and Joachim Crete, who had all he could do to steer himself, had no great mind to go to the rescue of his companion. "Let the rogue look after himself as best he can," said he. "I'm going for a drink." And by the dim light of the candle which glimmered in the distance through the half-opened door, he succeeded, after many stumbles and slips, to worm his way into the room, where he entered without closing the door behind him, so as to give the loiterer a chance to do the same. As soon as he had passed the threshold, you may well imagine that his first thought was to go right to the table where the glasses and the bottles stood. But as he was pouring out a gobletful of rum, swinging on his hips, he heard behind his back something like a groan. "That's you?" he said, without turning. "Here you are. Come on." Another moaning answered, stronger than the first. "What's the matter? Did you hurt yourself? Have a drink, that'll cure you." But no one appeared or responded. Quite surprised, Joachim Crete turned around, laying his glass on the table, and stood terrified, with his eyes fearfully fixed and his hair standing on end. It wasn't at all Hubert Sauvageot who was facing him. It was a huge black dog, as tall as a man, with formidable teeth, sitting on its haunches, and who stared at him with eyes blazing like embers. Without being a hero, the miller was not precisely a coward. After his first impression of terror, he plucked up his courage, and he called out to Hubert, "Who has let this dog in?" No answer. "Hubert," he insisted, stammering with a thick voice, "where does this dog come from?" Not a word. Why, that's rather cool. Get out of this, you!" The big dog gave a growl that sounded like a bit of laughter, but didn't stir a foot. And Hubert was nowhere to be seen. Joachim was anything but merry, as you may reckon. He couldn't understand what was going on, and as a dreadful fright was creeping over him again, he thought of making for the door. But the terrible dog had only to turn his head with his blazing eyes to bar the way. Seeing this, the poor man crawled backward to take refuge between the table and the bed without losing sight of the monster. The latter advanced a few steps with another hellish growl. "Hubert!" cried out the unfortunate man in a tone of horrible anguish. The dog kept moving toward him, erect on his legs, growling more and more, and keeping his burning eyes fastened on the trembling man. "Help! Help!" howled Joachim Crete, crazy with fear and backing himself up against the wall. None answered his call, but at that very moment the church bell pealing for the elevation was heard. Then a thought of repentance passed through the brains of the wretched man. "It is a Loup Garou!" cried he. "My God, forgive me!" And he fell on his knees. At the same time, the infernal beast darted upon him. Fortunately, the poor miller, while kneeling down, had felt something in the wall that caught him by the clothes. It was a reaping hook. The man instinctively seized the weapon and hit the brute right on the head. It was the matter of 1 instant. Everything disappeared in the dark. In the struggle, short as it had been, the table had been overturned, and the glasses, bottles, and candle were scattered on the floor. As to Joachim Crete, he had fainted away. When he returned to his senses, somebody was throwing cold water on his face, and a well-known voice was saying, "What has been the matter with you, Monsieur Joachim?" "Is that you, Hubert?" "As you see." "Where is he?" "Whom do you mean?" "The dog." "Which dog?" "The Loup Garou." "What?" "The Loup Garou I have released with my reaping hook." "Good heavens! Have you gone mad, Monsieur Joachim?" "I have not dreamt that, surely. And yourself, where are you from?" "From the mill." "I see. It is running now, the mill." "You can hear it." "Go and stop it right off. It must not work on Christmas." "Why, Christmas is past. It was yesterday." "How is that?" "You have been senseless for 2 days, that's all." Is it possible? But what is the matter with your ear? Blood." "It's nothing." "How did you get that? Speak out." "Don't you remember I had a fall in the mill on Christmas Eve?" "Yes." "Well, I cut my ear on the edge of a pail." Joachim Crate, my friends, sat up on his bed, haggard and shaken by a shiver of horror. "Oh, damnable wretch!" cried he. "It was you!" And the poor fellow fell back on his pillow, never to recover his wits again. He died 10 years later in a lunatic asylum. As to the mill, it was torn down and carried away in the spring at the breaking up of the ice. This story is so interesting because both Joachim and the woman who is telling the story interpret it as conclusive proof that skipping church can turn you into a werewolf. But the story itself leaves that part pretty ambiguous. I mean, we know that a huge dog magically appears in the mill, and we know that the mill magically stops working on Christmas, and that the hired man has a wound on his head, but we also know that everybody was drunk, and the lights went out, and the details are all pretty vague. Also, you would have expected some kind of Ebenezer Scrooge-like transformation, that Joachim becomes a very devout churchgoer and a religious man, but instead he just goes mad and dies in an asylum, which kind of undermines the intended effect of the story, I think. Louis Frechette was kind of a big deal. He was a poet, playwright, journalist, and short story writer who served as a member of the Parliament in Canada from 1874 to 1878. He was obviously bilingual, and he spent a lot of time in the U.S., specifically in Chicago, as a young man. A number of his plays were actually lost in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. He was the first Canadian to receive the Prix Montoyon from the Académie Française, and later in his life he was also made a Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George by the British Crown. I'm not sure why. He had a huge impact on French-Canadian literature, and he remains an important figure in Canadian history. This edition of the book, and therefore this video, was illustrated by Canadian painter Frederick Simpson Coburn. Coburn was a painter, illustrator, and photographer who studied in Montreal and in New York, and then all over Europe in Berlin, Paris, London, and Antwerp. He would come to specialize in the painting of horse and oxen-drawn sleds and sleighs. He illustrated this book pretty early in his career, and he seems to have had a really charming life, actually. He had a ton of exhibitions, he won a bunch of awards, somehow he also got an honorary doctorate of civil law, and at about 60 years of age after his wife's death, he took up dancing and he started a dance studio in Montreal. He died peacefully in his sleep at 89 years old. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, I make a little confession out here. This week's confession is that there's a huge windstorm happening here today. It's more moderate down in this part of the country than it is further into the north, but it is still pretty impressive. I learned, therefore, that the Dutch actually have a headwind cycling championship. So apparently when the winds are strong enough, they spontaneously call together this competition of biking into a headwind, which I think is lovely. Maybe it's compensation for the fact that they can't do the ice skating on the canals competition anymore. Or at least they haven't been able to do it for many years because the winters aren't cold enough. So my goal is to kind of integrate the background wind into the sound design for this episode. I hope it's not too distracting. I also hope everybody who has it worse than we do stays safe and dry. This is Restored Lore, where every week I find a strange, obscure, interesting old story and I share it with you. If you like this story, then you should definitely subscribe to this channel. It's growing pretty quickly. I'm very pleased with that. You can also like this video, share this video, and choose the notification bell so that you never miss a story. I will see you next week.